Hello, I'm Daniel Benjamin, and I am the president of the American Academy in Berlin, and I am really delighted to welcome you to our Stephen M. Kellen lecture with George Packer, who will be speaking tonight about his latest book, Last Best Hope, America in Crisis and Renewal. The Stephen M. Kellen Distinguished Visitorship honors Stephen Max Kellen, a German-American banker, patron, and founding benefactor of the American Academy in Berlin. Stephen Kellen was forced to leave Berlin in 1936 because of his Jewish heritage, and yet he remained profoundly committed to the city all of his life, supporting German companies during the revival of economic activity after World War II, and sponsoring cultural institutions like the Berlin Philharmonic. Today, we remain deeply indebted to Stephen M. Kellen as he, along with his wife Anne-Marie, who grew up in this house, provided the founding gift for the renovation of the villa that would become the American Academy. The Hans Arnold Center, where we are meeting now, is named after Stephen M. Kellen's father-in-law. And this particular distinguished visitorship has been endowed since 2004 and has brought quite an outstanding array of individuals to the Academy over the years, including artist Chuck Close, former World Bank president, diplomat, and author Robert Zoellick, and China scholar Elizabeth Economy. So let me now turn to our guest tonight. George Packer is one of America's foremost journalists. Indeed, I would argue he is one of America's few indispensable nonfiction writers. Now a staff writer for The Atlantic, he reported from 2003 to 2018 for The New Yorker on a wide range of subjects. Among his recent works are his biography, Our Man, Richard Holbrooke and the End of the American Century, which came out in 2019, and which I, as a recovering diplomat, can personally testify with great confidence was the best-read nonfiction book of the year in Democratic foreign policy circles. It was also, I would hazard, the best-read book among people who worked at the State Department in the Johnson, Carter, Clinton, and Obama administrations. Those are not entirely overlapping. Yes. No, I can't speak to its wider resonance, but I will say that there's a devoted cadre of readers in high and not so high places. Anyway, this has not been scientifically verified, but I would bet my house on it. I am guessing that the book was equally popular in American Academy circles because, as everyone here knows, Richard Holbrooke conceived of the American Academy during his time as ambassador and remained a central force in the life of the Academy for the remainder of his years. George Packer is also the author of the New York Times bestseller, The Unwinding, An Inner History of the New America, which won the 2013 National Book Award and which for many readers crystallized an understanding of the acute problems in American society. His earlier work, Assassin's Gate, America in Iraq, was one of the definitive works on the U.S. misadventure in Iraq. Assassin's Gate was named one of the 10 best books of 2005 by the New York Times and was on the best books of the year list of virtually every major publication. George Packer is also extraordinarily productive, so these are only a few of his many works, which include novels and a play. In the course of the last month or so, I have discovered something else, which is that in addition to being one of America's foremost journalists, George Packer seems to be one of the best-known Americans to have ever passed through Berlin. On multiple occasions, whether at the German Foreign Office, at events here, with friends from other walks of life, people have said to me either, "Oh, I'm so sorry I'll be out of town and will miss George," as if they were missing a visiting cousin, or, "Oh, I won't be able to make it to the event at the Academy, but I'll see George after," or, "I can't wait to catch up with George." Now, I'm not ordinarily a jealous person, but I did find this renown striking, until I remembered that George Packer has probably spent more time in Berlin and specifically at the Academy than anyone except a few staff. He is one of, I believe, only 2 people to have ever been a fellow here twice, in 2009 as our Holt-Spring Fellow, in 2014 as our Axel Springer Fellow. In 2019, he also visited and gave a presentation on the Holbrooke biography, which I have previously adverted to. So what I suppose that means is that George Packer is an outstanding example of what the Academy has done right. over its 24 years in terms of knitting together Americans and Germans, and for that I'm very proud and grateful. His most recent book, Last Best Hope, America in Crisis and Renewal, is the subject, of course, of tonight's talk. And in this book, which I would say is something of a pendant to The Unwinding, George Packer looks at the state of our union and finds it poisonous. He asks, how did we get here? How did we elect Donald Trump, who he calls, quote, an all-American flim-flam man and a demagogue? How did it happen that our founding vision that all men are created equal came to seem like a rancid joke? How did we wind up at each other's throats, talking about a nation so divided that some fear violence and predict secession? The resulting work is an unusual thing, an impassioned analysis, a deeply thought-out cri de coeur about the historic developments and economic changes that have led to our toxic tribalism. I've now read the book twice because I expected this event to happen some months ago, thank you, COVID, and both times I admired it tremendously, not least because it is a patriot's account of what went wrong, as well as an act of historical resurrection of some of the people in the past that have, in our history, gone right. In the best American tradition, it ends up on a note of hope, saying, yes, we can do better because we have done better. George, we're delighted to have you back at the Academy and very much look forward to the evening's talk and hearing more about your book and about perhaps also what you've been thinking since the book came out. Let me just say, before George takes the podium, to our Zoom audience, please send in those questions as early as you like. We'll get to them as fast as we can. They're going to give me the all-important iPad so that I can read them out, and we'll do the very best we can. Do it in the Q&A part of the Zoom platform, not in the chat. And don't put up your hand because no one will see it. And everyone else here, well, we've changed our rules for events, but please leave your masks on for now. So with that, it's all yours.
Thank you for that maybe overly generous introduction, Dan, and for being here and running this great institution, which really has a place in my heart because my kids came here at different stages of their lives, and just being here gives me these incredible flashbacks to when our son was this little tow-headed 2-year-old dangerously running along the pier over the lake as I followed him. And now I'm picturing him at 14, and I might still have to follow him as he runs along the pier. I don't know. I'm sentimental about the place and about Berlin and Germany because Germany has really been very kind to me, and I don't quite know why, but I'm grateful for it. And there are friends in this audience who I'm very glad to see. In 1838, a young Illinois state legislator named Abraham Lincoln, who was 28 at the time, gave a speech in Springfield on the perpetuation of our institutions. He asked, how might American democracy die? And he answered his question by saying there will be no Napoleon to come sailing across the ocean and the Blue Ridge Mountains to drink from the Ohio River. If destruction be our lot, we must ourselves be its author and finisher. As a nation of free men, we must live through all time or die by suicide. That was Lincoln 20 years before the Civil War, which was the closest we've come to dying by suicide, and he seemed to foresee it. So how might American democracy die? How might we commit suicide? One way would be slowly, subtly, almost imperceptibly, which is a dangerous way because by the time you realize it's happening, it's too late. What would that be? To me, that would be a loss of faith in the democratic idea, which really is the only thing that holds the country together. Not blood and soil, not even the Constitution and the laws, not our famous material pursuits, but in Whitman's words, writing just after the Civil War, the true nationality of the states, the genuine union when we come to a moral crisis, is the fervid and tremendous idea is in all caps in Whitman's text, melting everything else with resistless heat and solving all lesser and definite distinctions in vast, indefinite, spiritual, emotional power. That's Whitman's almost religious idea, civic religious idea of democracy. Today, the temperature of Whitman's fervid and tremendous idea has dropped dangerously low. Another way we could commit suicide is by civil war. And as I said, we came very close once. In the run-up to the 2020 election, normal people, not conspiracy-addled extremists, normal people asked their friends, do you think there's going to be a civil war? I was asked that. I asked that. I asked my friends, should I get a gun? I've never owned a gun. My wife said, no, you shouldn't. I didn't get a gun. But I thought about it for the first time in my life because there was violence in the air. You could feel it. The downtowns of Washington and New York and other cities emptied out, and shopkeepers boarded up their windows. Obviously, the summer of the George Floyd protests, which had led to some riots and destruction, influenced these decisions because people didn't know whether the violence would come from the right or the left or both. But there was just a sense that things had come unhinged, and the normal resolution of our problems might not hold this time. It did hold. And the election of 2020 is something I'm enormously proud of as an American. 155 million people voted in the middle of a pandemic, by far the greatest turnout in American history. And not only that, they did it with dignity and a kind of faith in Whitman's idea. It was an affirmation of that faith. It was also, in spite of Donald Trump's complaints, the cleanest, fairest, most unimpeachable election that I've seen in my life. Given all the obstacles of COVID and the pandemic, every single investigation of dead people voting or of fraud or of mail-in ballots that were piled up and checked in advance, none of it held up. It was inspected minutely because of bogus legal cases, and none of it held up. It was an incredible election. And so it seemed as if democracy had held until January 6th, and that's when the violence came. It took 2 months. January 6th was like an assassin's bullet that just missed. I think it was pretty close. And if a few more policemen had been unable to stop people from coming in, and if a few alert staffers had not been so quick to get members of Congress out of harm's way, some of them would have died. And if Trump had been successful in persuading a few more people to go along with his scheme to overturn the results of the election, and in doing so, to destroy our democracy, there would have been, I think, large-scale violence, and who knows how it all might have come out. So let's not be complacent at all. The assassin is still aiming the gun at us. The bullet missed. There might well be another shot. So liberal democracy is still hanging in the balance. It's still vulnerable, and it's vulnerable because the idea is vulnerable. The idea is fragile. If we have to sustain faith in that idea in order to continue to be a country, then in some ways America is actually more vulnerable, more fragile than countries that are held together by common memories and common traditions, common ethnicities. I think there are 3 red lines that cannot be crossed in liberal democracy without essentially beginning to destroy it. And they all showed themselves around the time of the insurrection. The first, there can be no allowance for group hatred. And group hatred cannot be used as a tool for gaining or holding on to power. Second, you have to play by the rules of democracy. When you lose an election, you have to accept the loss and then try again next time. And third, you have to tell the truth. All politicians lie. But when a politician or a party sees lying as a fundamental tool for gaining power, then the shared reality that liberal democracy requires of its citizens just to begin to have a common ground from which we can then argue it disappears. So those three things, hatred of groups, breaking the rules, and lying as a matter of course in order to hold on to power, all three of those have become, and this is going to be the partisan note, essential to the Republican Party and normal parts of their strategy for gaining and holding on to power, and certainly the Republican Party of Donald Trump, which basically is the Republican Party today. So that's a big part of the danger we're in. One party breaks the rules, crosses the red lines of liberal democracy routinely, and sometimes gets rewarded for it. But what I want to do is look at the deeper causes for our incredible polarization that Dan talked about. We're so polarized that any issue, even the Oscar slap, is eventually going to find its way into red and blue America as this impassioned, hateful argument. Anything can go that way. Certainly masking. Was there any other country where at the outset wearing a mask became a political weapon for one side or the other, where it divided the country politically immediately? To me, it was like blowing your nose in a Kleenex. It was just a simple way to keep yourself and others healthy. But in Trump's America, the mask became one more way in which Americans hated each other. So how did this happen? How do we become two countries in perpetual conflict? Well, let's go back to Tocqueville, who visited the United States in the 1830s and wrote what I think may still be the single best book on American democracy. Read it. It's incredible how much of it resonates today. At the beginning of democracy in America, Tocqueville wrote that the most striking thing about Americans was the equality of conditions. That was his phrase. It sounds like he means everyone has the same amount of property and money. That's not quite what he meant. What he meant was social equality, a sense of everyone has the same access, the same opportunity to the same fields of life. Nothing is closed to you because of your birth or because of your parents. Of course, this was the 1830s. Slavery was incredibly powerful in the South, and women couldn't vote, and there were all kinds of violations of the equality of conditions. But what Tocqueville meant, this is how people feel. He called it a passion, not an idea. Equality to Tocqueville was a passion. He said it was the inextinguishable, eternal passion of Americans, the desire to be as good as anyone else, to be able to look anyone in the eye on equal terms, not to be looked down upon, not to be excluded on the basis of your status. And for Tocqueville, this equality, which is almost a spiritual concept, it's not just equality before the law, it's a higher thing. For Tocqueville, it also was a dangerous thing because, as he said, aristocracy links everybody from peasant to king in one long chain. Democracy breaks the chain and frees each link. So while we're equal and apart. We are each pursuing our own interests and fortunes, and there's nothing inherent to hold us together because that's the nature of equality. So the passion for equality can lead to extreme inequality. Tocqueville called it individualism. He invented that word, and Americans are famous for that. So it could even lead to so much inequality that a new aristocracy arises out of equality. It's a kind of paradox, but I think Tocqueville was quite prescient there. His solution for individualism is what he called the art of self-government. Self-government, to me, is a bit distinct from democracy. I think of democracy as somewhat abstract, rights, laws, rules. Self-government is action. It's what people do together to solve problems, to run their own affairs. And I think in America, equality, the passion, and self-government, the art, are in a perpetual relation to each other. They're essential to each other. When equality starts to disappear, there's no longer any basis for shared citizenship, and self-government is lost. Self-government is not natural. We're not born knowing how to do it. In fact, in human history, it's an exception. It's hard. It requires skills. Tocqueville called it habits of the heart. It requires an ability to first see the other as an equal, and second, to listen, to argue, to compromise, to solve problems together. It's not natural. And I think we've come close to forgetting how to do it. And I think it has something to do with the disappearance of equality. So for the past half century, we've had two major trends, and we're not the only country. And later I'll talk about how we're becoming more, not less, like Europe in the age of Trump. The first trend is the end of the industrial era, the rise of the knowledge economy, of globalization, of technology, with the opportunities that it's presented, and also with the increasing inequality that's come with it. Because ever since the 1970s, when the era of globalization and the deindustrialization began, we've seen inequality grow inexorably every year, no matter who's in office, Democrat or Republican, no matter if it's wartime or peacetime, no matter if it's boom or recession, inequality keeps growing. And that was not true before the end of the industrial age. The second trend is the unwhitening of America, the rise of the Black freedom movement, which brought that whole population that Tocqueville understood had been left out of equality closer and closer into the full rights of equal citizens, and mass immigration from the global South. So a huge change in the kinds of Americans who not only compose the population, but who were in positions of power. So just when we needed to extend equality to a whole new range and diversity of Americans, inequality began to grow. So much so that social mobility, that famous American dream of limitless opportunity, of improving yourself, of transcending where your parents started, that began to decline, so that today American mobility is lower than European, which has not been true through most of our history. So to sum it up, inequality has undermined the common faith that Americans need to create a successful multi-everything democracy. During the period before this era, there were two main narratives in American politics. One I call the fair shake, basically giving everyone a shot. That was the Democratic Party's narrative. The other I call getting ahead, business enterprise, individual initiative. That was the Republican Party's narrative. And although there were tremendous conflicts, especially over race during segregation and the civil rights era, those two narratives held pretty steady. One favored the working person, the other business. But with these really earth-shaking changes that I just described, beginning in the 70s, those two narratives began to fade away. And the two parties changed pretty dramatically. And they've been replaced now by four narratives. We are red and blue. Every time there's an election, we realize again how deep the division is and how even the division is. And that's because an election imposes a binary choice. But I think underneath that binary choice, there are four narratives, because both red and blue are in turn divided within themselves. So what do I mean by that? I'll go through the four narratives, and there's a chronological order here. I call the first free America. That was Reagan's America, the shining city on the hill, the America of get government off my back, cut my taxes, deregulate my business, and each of us will be able to pursue our own fortunes with our own talents, and will be a magnet for energetic, enterprising people around the world. It was an open narrative, and it saw America as exceptional, as representing freedom to the nations. It was attractive, and Reagan made it attractive in his rhetoric. It became the orthodoxy of the Republican Party. And up till this day, Republicans still run on the same almost mantra or even cargo cult of statements about taxes and deregulation, even though there's a lot of evidence that cutting taxes does not increase wages or produce jobs. In fact, just the opposite. So it has remained the elite narrative of the Republican Party. After Reagan, a new narrative rose related to free America. I call it smart America. That's the narrative of the educated professionals who are the winners in the knowledge economy. Those who've been to college, and the right college, and entered the right profession and done well, and see themselves as connected to others around the world in their same category, who find themselves maybe closer to people in London or Berlin than people 20 miles away outside the metropolitan area where they live. This became the elite narrative of the Democratic Party under Clinton. So a party that had been essentially the party of labor and the working class in the 90s became more and more the party of educated people. And that's been more true every year, so that now, among white Americans, the single biggest predictor of how they'll vote is whether or not they have a college education. What's wrong with smart America? Well, it sounds like meritocracy, and that's a word that smart America loves, but it's become something else, because families in smart America know how to make sure that the benefits stay within their family, and the family business of success is passed on from generation to generation because they know the right people. They read the right books to their children when they're young and take them on the right vacations and send them to the right colleges, and then their children in turn marry into smart America. They don't marry out of it. And it's become more and more, I think, a new kind of aristocracy, perhaps the way Tocqueville predicted, where you don't make yourself a meritocrat. You're born into the meritocracy. There's no better example than Jared Kushner, who in a truly meritocratic system would barely be surviving. So in a way, these elite narratives promised a kind of abundance of freedom and prosperity and fairness, and they delivered profound inequality, a stratified society, and a new aristocracy. And so, unsurprisingly, their promises have led to a kind of disillusionment and cynicism among other kinds of Americans. So the next narrative following the Clintons, and I think Obama is also the embodiment of smart America, is what I call real America. This is a rebellion among some of the left behind Americans who don't see themselves in the dreams of the educated class, and who may even feel despised by more educated Americans. Real America is a phrase Sarah Palin used in the 2008 campaign. She said, "I love being here," she was in North Carolina, "in real America, where the people who make our food, grow our food, and teach our children and fight our wars live. You real Americans are the true patriots." It was quite invidious, because what she was doing was saying there are real Americans. She didn't use this phrase, but I would say she meant white Christian heartland Americans without very good educations, who don't work in the knowledge economy. And the people who are not real Americans are who? Well, me, people who live in cities, people with college degrees, black people, immigrants from non-white countries. And she didn't have to spell it out. Everyone understood who the real Americans were. And To me, Palin, who's now semi-forgotten and kind of a figure of ridicule, was more important than we remember. She was John the Baptist for Donald Trump, because her sort of ridiculous version of Real America became Trump's powerful and convincing version that allowed him to win an election and to nearly win a second one. Real America is closed, insecure, angry, aggrieved. They talk about freedom, but it's not the same freedom of Reagan. It's not that sense of opportunity and openness. It's an angry freedom that basically says, get off my property, don't tread on me, don't touch my gun. It's defensive, and it's based on a sense of having been left behind or pushed out of line by people who don't deserve to be in line. And it is the narrative of the base of the Republican Party. The head of the party remains stuck in the Reagan ideology of libertarianism, but the body of the party is nationalist and ethno-nationalist. In that sense, maybe a little more like a European movement than we've seen in America, maybe more like what Berlusconi tapped in Italy and Orban in Hungary and Le Pen in France. That's why I think we have drawn closer to European politics. We did not have an ethno-nationalist party that produced a president in this country. We certainly had white nationalism, but that was almost the default position. And within that, there was a lot of room for other things. But now we have white identity politics, which is explicitly about race and religion, and which has seized the imaginations of Republican voters. The fourth narrative is also aggrieved and rebellious, and generationally so. It's what I call just America. And that is the narrative that drove young people into the streets after the murder of George Floyd. It's a really overdue forcing of white Americans to face the legacy of slavery and segregation that we've never really faced in our country. And I look to Germany as an example of how we might do that, but we don't seem to have it in us in quite the way Germany has done it. There was no slavery museum on the mall, for example, as there should have been. So it has this incredibly necessary forcing of a reckoning. But like Real America, it has taken a turn into illiberalism, into a kind of narrative that sees not individuals, but people as members of identity groups, almost a metaphysics of group identity, so that your whole essence is defined by that. You are no longer that complex mix of motives and interests and identities that individuals are. So in a way, both Real and Just America have this illiberal strain that is intolerant of disagreement, that is suspicious of free speech, and that divides us into groups so that there's an almost perpetual polarization. They're also both isolationist, by the way. It's interesting that Free and Smart America, in different ways, both saw the United States as a country that had to look outward and had to be open to the world. Real and Just America are withdrawing inside. There is really no interest. Real America because it's nationalist and doesn't want to do anyone else any favors as they see alliances. Just America because basically it's concerned with justice in America, not the rest of the world. So each of the four narratives I've just described responds to real problems. I don't dismiss them. They offer values that each of the others lack. But each of them fails to, in Baldwin's terms, achieve our country. They all create winners and losers, a kind of zero-sum struggle for status. They all divide us tribe against tribe. And the result is, not only are we polarized, but we can't govern ourselves any longer. We have lost that art. We can't talk to each other. We can't reason with each other. We can't even agree on whether the sun is going to come up tomorrow. If I say it will, then someone of the other political tribe is going to tell me all the reasons why. That's just because I'm a member of the liberal media. So what we have to do, and it's a tall order, the only way out of this impasse is to restore the art of self-government and to create conditions of greater equality. Because I think, as I said, those two are intimately tied. And so this brings me to my narrative, which is perhaps grandiose sounding. It's more like a hope than a narrative. I call it Equal America. The pandemic revealed the deep ills, the underlying conditions that showed how unfair our economy is. We had this whole category of essential workers. Who were they? They were people who had to go to work or else they'd get fired. And they were the least paid workers in our economy: hospital workers, drivers, warehouse workers, supermarket cashiers. For a little while, there was a kind of wave of sympathy for them. Then we forgot about them because the non-essential workers, the journalists, the lawyers, the architects, the consultants, the accountants, could work at home with a laptop and were at far less risk of getting COVID before there was a vaccine. To me, that just revealed in the most stark terms the deep inequality and unfairness of the economy. And when Joe Biden came into office, it seemed to me that he had an agenda for Equal America. Most of his legislative ideas, minimum wage, pro-union, anti-monopoly, shore up the social safety net, increase the status and working conditions for people in education, people in healthcare, and spend money on infrastructure, creating jobs for people who don't have college degrees. So it's not just blue America, it's all of America that would benefit from Biden's agenda. As you know, he hasn't passed much of it. And that's another subject that maybe we can talk about when we do questions. But basically, I think without something like that agenda, the toxicity of our politics, the constant boiling temperature we're at, will not go down. Because I think underneath it, there is this rancor that comes from seeing some people in a perpetual state of privilege and others constantly falling further behind. But the other half of what we have to do is to restore the art of self-government. And I'll talk about two categories. One is education, the other is journalism. When I talk about the art of self-government, it's really something rather subtle and vague. It's the culture we live in. It's how we think. It's how we talk. It's the language we use. It's the way we deal with each other. It's whether we see each other as fellow citizens and are capable of actually listening long enough to disagree based on something in common rather than simply to dismiss. I think today our politics is marked above all by contempt. Contempt runs through our culture like some kind of acidic agent. It corrodes everything it touches. It relieves you of the burden of having to take seriously anything that the other despised person says. It puts you in a position of moral superiority on the cheap. This is why it feels good. You can see I'm talking, among other things, about Twitter. This is what Twitter does. It is a drug that induces you to act worse than you really are in order to feel better than you really do. It's almost an antidepressant, although I think it also has depressing effects. So when we ask, will Elon Musk fix Twitter or make it worse? My hope is he just destroys it and loses $44 billion and people stop using it, because I think basically it is a symptom and a cause of why we can't govern ourselves. And many journalists, including ones I know, have been seduced by this drug into spending all day long on their phone rather than doing what journalists are supposed to do, which is listen and talk to people and learn things. So in education, right now we're in a state of constant battle. Children who had to spend a year or more at home staring at a screen without friends around now have the spectacle of their parents showing up at school board meetings and making fools of themselves. We're so caught by the ideological battle between right and left, which is now fought out in our classrooms, that we've forgotten what education is for. And we've forgotten the kids. It's as if they're now an experiment for the adults to act out their own pathologies. Education in the beginning in America, public education, was for making democratic citizens. That was Horace Mann's idea of the common school. I think we need to get back to something like that. That could mean a lot of things, both the content of our curriculum and also the way we teach children not what to think, but how to think. How to think. And it should include civic education, too, which has disappeared partly because it became too controversial in a polarized society. And it could even include, after secondary school, a year of national service. I can't think of any more direct way to break down the barriers between Americans of different backgrounds, different views, different regions, races, political ideas, than to have them spend a year together working on a common project. I sometimes think that we're becoming like Bosnia or the Middle East, where we need foreign NGOs to come in and set up a project of building a school or putting on a play and supervising it carefully so that red and blue Americans don't kill each other, but actually learn that they can work together. So I'm going to end, maybe appropriately here, with Thomas Mann. In the late 30s, he fled the Nazis and came to America. And in 38, he gave a coast-to-coast lecture tour that was called The Coming Victory of Democracy, which is quite a hopeful title in 1938. And he said, "We must define democracy as that form of government and of society which is inspired above every other with the feeling and consciousness of the dignity of man." The dignity of man. Now, if you talked this way today, you would get ratioed on Twitter. You would be met with contempt. It almost invites contempt. And even Mann was worried that his words sounded ridiculous. The dignity of man, this was the period of concentration camps and show trials. But he went on, and yet it is fact, more true today than ever, that we cannot allow ourselves, because of so much all too well-founded skepticism, to despise humanity. Despite so much ridiculous depravity, we cannot forget the great and the honorable in man, which manifest themselves as art and science, as passion for truth, creation of beauty, and the idea of justice. So a very high calling. Democracy as that system which most allows for the dignity of man. Thomas Mann came from the old world to the new and called American democracy to its better self in order to stop the spread of totalitarianism and war. And today, the call is coming to us again, this time from Ukraine. Ukrainian resistance to Russia's aggression reminds us of what is at stake, the half-forgotten values of our own democratic struggle, which in a roundabout way I think is deeply tied to what's happening in Ukraine right now. It reminds us of why the fervid and tremendous idea is as fragile as it is precious, and of how much we stand to lose if we allow the enemies of democracy, including the ones inside our own heads, to triumph. Thank you.
There's way too much to wrap one's arms around, but I want to start off with a question that will, I think, lead to some of the well springs of what's troubling you. You talk about in your book, you talk about your neighbor and the revelation that she was a Trump Republican. And I'd like you to talk a little bit about that relationship, and then if you have more to add on the kinds of exchanges you've had, presumably doing book promotion, which has brought you in contact with other Trump Republicans or people who are at least sympathetic with some of the grievances and antipathies that are typical of that group.
It's sort of a sad story. Right before the 2020 election, my family was out of the city up in farmland, and our neighbors were farmers who had lived there for many generations. and they were people we got along with very well and liked and respected. And suddenly one night, there were the Trump signs by the goat pasture, and my kids couldn't quite fathom it because they know these people. How could they do this? And I knew that I would never bring this up with our neighbors, because if I did, we would immediately be arguing, and the argument would take us away from politics, and this is part of the problem, to deep values, and from deep values to existential threats, until each of us saw the other as essentially holding that loaded gun. And so I said nothing, and we went on exchanging neighborly politenesses and favors, and I haven't talked to them about it to this day. And you ask about running into other people, and the truth, Dan, is I don't really run into Trump voters very much. I'm living in my bubble, and for 2 years I was stuck, kind of unable to do much interviewing because of COVID, which is why I wrote this book. This book is a COVID book. It's a book by a desperate person who is quarantined. When I do talk to them, and I have in promoting the book done some podcasts with right-wing interviewers, we reach a point where they just say A is B. And there is really nothing to be said after that. You cannot convince them that A is A. So I guess that's a failure on my part, but it's a truth that the spirit of exchange and of argument and of really raucous, energetic debate just doesn't exist in very much anymore. Instead, what we have is armed camps.
So I completely agree about how we are doing political discussion these days. But I've collected a number of stories of people, for example, one friend who told the story of his son. This is an East Coast member of Smart America, doing a bike trip and getting deep into Red America. And as long as they weren't talking politics, people, couldn't have been nicer. Put them up in their barns, put them up in their houses, things like that. And it seems to me that there's a hypothesis to be tested, which is that when we get off of Twitter, when we get off of cable news, we actually might find a way to deal with one another. We may have problems when we get to arguments about values and politics, but there's still a lot of cohesion. I mean, the political scientists are always saying that Red America and Blue America actually agree on 80% of the issues. It's those marginal 20% that always wind up being the wedge issues.
So in other words, the question is, are the sources of polarization real, or are they ginned up by politicians and media figures who profit from having Americans at each other's throats? And there is something to be said for that. Cable news I could have thrown in with Twitter as a really toxic cultural engine that benefits an elite and that hurts the rest. I think that's true up to a point. Yes, when we talk about national issues, when we talk about national politics, everything immediately goes to hell. When we talk about solving a local problem, repaving a road or a solar farm or whatever the issue is in a local place, and this goes back to Tocqueville, who thought you really do have to be face-to-face for democracy to work. So part of the problem is we're not face-to-face, we're avatar to avatar. Then I do think that Americans are fully capable of seeing each other as fellow citizens. But I noticed this way back in 2008. I was reporting on the Obama-McCain race in Ohio, in Appalachian, Ohio, and I wanted people to talk to me about what had happened to coal mining in their area, and what they wanted to talk about was what they'd seen last night on cable news. There was no more local news. There was no more local newspaper. It had disappeared, and they didn't see themselves as having
any reality as just people who live there. The only way to be real was to watch cable news and then argue as if we're all talking heads on TV. So that was a strange revelation.
Yeah, so you've answered my next three questions. But it seems to me that one of the things that we are struggling with is the disappearance of the local.
Yeah.
That, we wind up being siloed by the news sources that we prefer, and then we do battle on the venues that allow us to, like Twitter, like Facebook, like, any number of different things, right. Instagram, you name it. And you are really good in your book in talking about, for example, the disappearance of local newspapers. You mentioned Tocqueville and voluntary associations. I think Robert Putnam got a lot of this with Bowling Alone, that we have allowed ourselves to let the solvents of a really wealthy economy to dissolve us, or at least for many of us, and for others, it's isolation and alienation.
And the incentives are all perverse right now.
Right.
Again, journalism, which is the field I know best, the incentives are not to spend a month in some obscure, unknown backwater of the country and talk to people no one's ever heard of and find out beyond the sound bites how they live and what they think. To me, that is what journalism is all about. It's an incredible privilege. It's a thrill. The incentives don't allow for that. The financial incentives, but also the status incentives. You don't make a name for yourself by doing that. It's very hard. Former fellow here, Alec McGillis, that's how he pursues his career, and I really respect it. He should be better known. He's not, because Twitter, branding yourself and becoming known for saying things that get people hot, whether they're for you or against you, is unfortunately the way a lot of young journalists think they have to do it in order to succeed in a very difficult field where the jobs have been disappearing for years. So the incentives don't lead to those skills that I think are part of the art of self-government. Reporting is one of them. Instead, they lead to the performative showmanship that's so much a part of politics and culture.
And screaming on Fox or CNN or wherever about what's wrong with the world. So your other books, you mentioned it's a COVID book, your other books have been deeply reported. And this is a little bit of a Jeremiah, a little bit of a sermon, a little bit of a exhortation to do better. What was it like to change gears like that?
It was risky and hard because, most of my work is narrative and takes me 3 or 4 years and 100 or more interviews. And I recede and the characters come to the fore. And my model for each of my last few books has always been a novel or a novelist. Our Man, my model was Joseph Conrad. Like, how would Conrad have told the story of Richard Holbrooke? As if it was a yarn on a boat that was moored in the Thames for a night. That was my idea of how to talk about Richard Holbrooke and make it exciting. This book is, it's Jeremiah, it's also a lament, and it's an essay. Essays, you're like a performer on stage with no set, no other characters, it's just you. And if you fail, if you start to drift or lose the audience, it's all over. And your thoughts, every page, every paragraph, your thoughts are the action. So your thoughts had better be interesting, they'd better be lively, and they'd better make sense. So it was actually harder in some ways than writing those longer, more reported narratives.
Yeah. You talk in the book about patriotism, and yet you say at the same time you're from Smart America, and part of the problem with Smart America is that we tend not to, and I think we're from similar milieus, but that we tend not to be inclined towards patriotism. If anything,
it's embarrassing.
We're globalists.
Yes.
Right. As our critics would say.
Yeah.
So how did you find patriotism, or what did it for you?
Reporting.
Yeah.
Reporting. The Unwinding was 3 years of going over and over again back to rural North Carolina, the tobacco and textile region that had become quite depressed, to Youngstown, the Rust Belt that had lost its steel industry, Tampa Bay, where the housing boom and the housing bust had come and gone like a tornado, and just talking to people and feeling, whatever their views or mine, there is something that makes us American. There's something like a national identity. There's something that holds us together. We're not a family. Orwell in World War II wrote that England was a family with the wrong members in control. It's a great one-liner. We are not a family. I'd have this passage in which I describe us as being like people who've come together to do things together but who don't know each other, like at a fair, at a carnival. It's chaotic, it's raucous, everyone's doing something different, but somehow the fact of being there together, trying to do this thing together is what holds us together. And I have a long description of all the traits that people recognize as American. For example, first names instead of last names, which has now infected all of Europe too.
Not quite.
Maybe not quite. Maybe not yet fully in Germany. Or, for example, your waiter saying, "Hi, my name is Justin, and I'll be taking care of you tonight." Like, what other country would a waiter have that kind of breezy familiarity? And it seems almost like it's undignified, but that's how American waiters are. What is it that, even our violence, there's something about our violence that seems particularly American. Road rage. Why do you go from an argument over who cut who off to shooting somebody? Well, I think all of these things, the good and the bad, are complete cluelessness about complex social niceties in foreign countries. It's all about equality. It's all about a culture in which you aren't immediately aware of your social position in relation to everyone else, and in which you kind of expect and demand a certain level of respect, of equal respect. So I think equality is the passion that creates a kind of common culture. And that common culture remains. It's the ligaments have been stretched. Some of them might be about to snap, but there is something that makes us all American and that I actually love. And patriotism's dangerous because it can lead to aggression, can lead to stupidity and hubris, and to us, not you, to division. I think of it as being like your love for your family. Your love for your family doesn't mean that you don't want to be around anyone else. It doesn't even mean you think your family's better than everyone else, but it means that your first affection and loyalty and concern is for your family. And there's nothing wrong with that, but it's true that we smart Americans, with our globalist connections and our embarrassment about the flag, have lost some of that. And I think it's cost us and cost America a lot, because without patriotism, you can't do big things. You cannot create the national cohesion that you need to address global warming, inequality, racism, or the threat to democracy. All of those require some kind of common identity that's patriotism.
Yeah. So I know you didn't ask, but I'll tell you that I found patriotism by working in the government, actually, and traveling around, all over the country, either with the president or in various military things, and really getting to know people who I otherwise never would have known.
So by your job too.
Yeah. So it was my job too. Most of my reporting was overseas, so I became a globalist that way, but I became a patriot by working in the government.
That's great.
So one of the things that I like about your book is also one of the things that I won't say frustrated me, but it left me with a question mark, and that is, when I read the book, I said, I like the way that he interweaves these different sources of problems in our society, but I'm not quite sure what the whether there is an ultimate source or a multiplicity of sources. And let me make that more specific by saying in political science, the question is it inequality or is it race? And you tilt a little more towards inequality, I would say, and your talk about equality is in your talk here is, I think, very much to the point. And yet there are plenty of social scientists who will say it's race.
Well, I said that there were two trends. One, the economic changes that have produced inequality. The other, the demographic changes that have produced the unwhitening of America. I think that they are inextricable because, as I pointed out earlier, which Americans vote Democratic? Which white Americans? If it were purely about race, all white Americans would see a threat coming from the unwhitening of America. But for some reason, educated Americans don't seem to see that threat because they vote for the party that has a black president or a black vice president. Republicans vote for the party that only has white candidates, and its base has become the white working class, meaning people without a college education. So I think bigotry and fear and anxiety are not fixed, eternal sentiments. They can ebb and flow. They can be manipulated by a demagogue. They can be manipulated by events and experiences. And I think it's the convergence of the fear of the other and the resentment of the other with the sense of falling hopelessly behind that's produced this toxic white identity politics. So I guess I say it's both, and I don't want to have to choose. But it's true that for me, maybe because Tocqueville put the idea in my head, I see equality, which includes race, obviously. In fact, Ralph Ellison said the issue of equality has been the moral issue of American history, the ability of the black American to have equality. That is the core issue, and I think that's true, but it's another version of equality.
So I'll ask one more question, then turn it to the audience. You are, I would say, hopeful without being prescriptive in the book, and there's a strand in the social science literature that I have to say, kind of gets you really depressed, and that is that things won't change without a disaster. Things won't change without a catastrophe. What do you think?
I thought COVID was pretty disastrous, and I thought coming out of COVID, I wrote the book between the election and the inauguration, very quickly, compressed, and I finished the book when Joe Biden had just been inaugurated and the vaccine had just become available. And that's where hope and renewal come from. I thought the experience of COVID would make us see we had to do fundamental changes to our economy and to the way we live and to the way we act as citizens because it had been such a disaster, with America leading the world throughout in deaths and illnesses and infections per capita. So that didn't happen because the polarization was deeper than the recognition of these ills. And we're stuck. We're right where we were in 2016 and in 2018 and in 2020. So I don't know what catastrophe could get us out of polarization. Honestly, I have a kind of simple answer, which is the Republican Party has to experience a catastrophe. It has to lose election after election with Trumpism as its message until finally ambitious, opportunistic, craven politicians stop following Trump and pursue something closer to a democratic vision. But I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon.
Yeah, I was going to say, you're not leaving me a lot of room here to feel better.
What about you, Dan? What catastrophe?
Well, I would
could
just
you
say
imagine?
about COVID that it unfortunately it too much seems like it's nature working its way. We smart Americans, if I can be so offensive, look at it and look at the political failures that led to huge numbers of excessive deaths. And I think a lot of Americans just view this as, culling of the herd, that it was the older people who were going to get it and that this is just God's way. And
some Democrats see it that way, too, because the unvaccinated tend to be Trump voters.
I hope they don't say it too loudly.
I hear it all the time. Yeah. So anyway, we have to hope for catastrophe.
I was hoping you were going to give me a non-catastrophic road to the future.
I don't have one. I just think we're
so
deeply stuck. We're so deeply
Okay.
stuck. Yeah. But maybe someone out here has one. Please.
I thought you were going to start an organization for national renewal through local government, but
that would be a good start. It probably can't be the answer because we're a country and it has to happen nationally.
Hopeful questions, please. Josh.
Thank you, Josh Lewis. I'm a trailing spouse at the American Academy, which is, I'm sure your partner can attest, is a great gig. In the tradition of the American Academy, this will be a question. I do have a pitch. I start with a quick wind-up. First of all, your writing over time has been one of the several sources for me of framing these questions. And so I just want to thank you for that.
Well, thank you.
Publicly. Very helpful. Another one, which I expect you may be familiar with, is the work of Golden and Katz, The Race Between Education and Technology. And if you're not, it plays right into it. And so what it describes, it is fundamentally accepted by labor economists that changes in technology drive fundamental changes in labor markets. And if education does not catch up or keep up, we have profound changes in inequality and mobility. This happened in the Industrial Revolution, and it's happening in the knowledge economy. And for all sorts of reasons, I commend this to you.
Golden and Katz.
Golden and Katz, The Race Between Education and Technology.
Good.
It may not leave you feeling hopeful, but it does. It will give the underlying economic explanation for why it is that you focused in part on education as a piece of this. It will go into the labor economics of why this is actually true.
Thanks for the idea.
And so my question, so this is the question, you focused on inequality, you touched on mobility. Inequality has obviously expanded dramatically since 1980. Mobility stalled around 1980. Yeah. And Europe, the fact that Europe is got greater mobility, depends where in Europe, of course, is an interesting fact, but probably not so relevant to most Americans who are frustrated by mobility. And so my question is, as you have been out there reporting and experienced this in places where I certainly don't go, to what degree is it's the either or question, mobility or inequality?
Yeah. I think what preoccupies people is mobility. Right. I think inequality is how people interested in quantifiable forces see it, and inequality and mobility are obviously related. Of course. Yeah. So if inequality it becomes so great that you're stuck, it's impossible to rise from the bottom fifth to the middle fifth, for example, or it's impossible for someone from the bottom fifth to get into a top college, which is practically true at this point. So they're related. But I think mobility is what Americans care most about. Opportunity, whether opportunity is equal, whether it's fair, or whether there is a kind of fixed privileged class that protects its own privileges, whose purpose is to protect its privileges and to keep the unwashed out. And I think that's the corroding feeling, and that's the feeling of being stuck where you are. But I do think, I mean, you obviously know a lot about this, so you could correct me if I'm wrong, but I do think policies that address inequality also would address mobility, but education is kind of the key to unlock mobility.
It is the key. Policy responses impact both. Some policy responses impact more one than the other. The underlying policies, ultimately, it's like it's turtles all the way down. You ultimately get back to education.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, education systems only evolve so quickly, and ours is evolving slowly, particularly in K-12, public K-12 in particular. And society's response to education is a generational thing.
Right.
Meanwhile, if you look at the speed of the technology revolution in the United States and then the speed of the Industrial Revolution, this one is going at, you know, an order of magnitude.
Warp speed. Yep.
And so society can only respond so fast.
Thank you.
Okay, we're going to have to give Josh a fellowship, too. Right up here. But you weren't using a microphone, so forget that.
Thank you. This is more on education. Back in the 60s, we had this issue of school prayer. And prayer was...
No. The issue's back.
The issue's back. But so a certain group of Americans decided they wanted to opt out of the public education system, which in your scheme of things was a equalizer potentially, but also a force for coherence of creating citizens and
right.
citizenship and investment in democracy, including civic education, et cetera, et cetera. So a larger and larger swath of America was driven out of, or drove itself out of, this communal education system to religious-based education, which, dare I say, is not always fact-based, is not always based on truthism,
yep.
and drives them further away. We now have homeschooling, which probably takes that a step further in the wrong direction. How do you see this coming together? It's not just the education that was just discussed in terms of quality, but it's also the bifurcation of the system, which is creating the next generation of thinkers who will find it more challenging to bring into the tent.
And COVID, I wrote a short piece about this in The Atlantic. COVID has driven rather astonishing numbers of families out of the public schools, partly because I know this firsthand as a parent. Public schools did so much worse than the private schools in dealing with COVID and bringing kids back quickly, and partly because the temperature is so hot now between the anti-CRT and the
you should spell that out.
Critical race theory, which has become a rubric for essentially the new progressivism in education, teaching about white supremacy, teaching about our history, our legacy of slavery and segregation, etc. There's an excess on the left for sure. I know this. My son was educated in that excess in a progressive public school. There's now been an even more excessive reaction from the right. So that's what I was talking about earlier about the way in which schools have become these laboratories for different political agendas to battle it out. This is not new. School prayer was the same thing in the 60s. I think that the trends are all toward further division, COVID being part of that. But one thing COVID did was showed parents how bad their children's education is, because they looked over their shoulder at the screen and saw either an unqualified teacher or an overwhelmed teacher or a curriculum that made no sense. They noticed their children were never assigned books to read, let alone good books. So these political battles are taking place in a context of woeful education, both in the humanities and the sciences. I'm mostly concerned with the humanities. So there's no simple answer. There's all sorts of high-minded and well-intentioned projects to restore education to some kind of citizen-creating function in which there is a curriculum that makes sense across the board. It changes from, we also have 50 different education systems because we're Americans and that's the way we are. But I have come, and maybe this is because of being a parent, I have come to see education as being at the heart of all of this. I don't have any glib solutions, but I'd like to keep focusing on it because I think without changing education in some ways to create citizens, we're going to keep creating people incapable of being citizens.
There was a hand in the back. There it is.
Hello, Janus Ahlefeld, political advisor to the Social Democrats in
A little
Parliament.
louder, please. I don't know if that mic's working.
Pardon?
A little louder, please.
Janus Ahlefeld, I forget the rest. I try to generalize a little bit more in terms of equality. I think that's also one of the forces, or the lack of it, driving polarization in this country and other European countries well, and populist drives too. I wonder, and I've been thinking about a lot of the conflicts, whether it goes back to that, let's say, conflict also of the industrial period between urban and rural areas. And I think we were thinking that with, let's say, the spread of the internet, in a sense, our access to, and the opportunities for good jobs in far distant places would improve. But let's say, looking at the process of globalization over the past 2 decades, I see there's more tendency towards clustering. And there are many people, let's say, for example, in Syria or out in Africa, who always or all day long see the lifestyle of the rich in New York, in Paris, in London, in Berlin. And let's say it's very far off. And you probably can translate that to people in the Midwest as well, or in people in East Germany. How can we steer the progress or those technological opportunities in a way that it provides for more equal lives and access and opportunity? Because I think the frustration, seeing it all day long and not being able, is increasing tensions in our societies enormously.
Yeah, I agree with you. There's this psychological pressure of being both intimate with the lifestyles and the wealth and the culture of the winners in the knowledge economy, and this incredible distance from it. I noticed this when I was reporting from West Africa, how so many young men and women were deeply familiar with American hip-hop culture, with clothing, shoes, sports, and money, but they were living in absolute destitution. So the conflict between their imaginations and their conditions was becoming a kind of explosive one. And is that true of the rural-urban divide? I don't know that it is exactly the same thing. There is a huge rural-urban divide. Along with the education divide, that is the most profound one. The one that globalization, let's say rural, including old industrial towns that are losing their populations. Fading towns, small towns, rural areas, those are the losers of globalization. And the losers of energy, because immigrants don't go to those places. They go to the metropolitan areas, and so do the talented, the smart, the educated. And Alec McGillis has written about this. The inequality of regions becomes greater and greater. And I don't know what reverses that. And I don't know if technology can. I mean, one thing I learned about technology is at the start of COVID, there was this little optimistic idea that children would be able to get incredibly interesting educations through their screens because they'd have access to so many different things. And instead, they played video games or chatted on Instagram and got depressed. So I'm a bit of a technophobe, I have to admit. I've never posted on Twitter or Facebook just because I think I couldn't handle the drug. I think it would probably get the better of me. So I don't have an answer for how to close that technological gap. But in a way, the people I know who live in rural America don't envy the lives of the globalists. They don't think of that as something they want. They despise it. They think of it as unmanly or as super refined. And you know, we know how to do a tech startup, but we don't know how to fix our car. There's something almost perverse about that. So it doesn't feel like envy and longing so much as like contempt between those two.
Thank you. A remark and a question. The remark is actually a thank you. It's probably been told to you, I'm saying nothing new when I say that this presentation of the For America reminds me of Walter Russell's Mead's distinctions of the Wilsonian, the Hamiltonian, the Jacksonian, the Wilsonian. So a matrix of how to think about American thought in terms of foreign policy seems to me that your matrix of free, smart, real, and just America is the domestic policy equivalent of that, and to a non-American, that's greatly educational and helpful in trying to understand America.
And they do have their foreign policy versions as well.
Indeed. Yeah. Now, your solution to all of this is equal America, and that is congruent with one half of the theories about why we have populism, the economic and the cultural theories, and you opt for the economic with your. And I'm wondering whether the inhabitants of real America would actually agree with you.
Probably not. Probably not. As I said, they look at the winners of the global economy and say, that's at best. Not, for me, and at worst, evil. I just think culture, deliberate efforts to change culture, to address people's most profoundly held values, to argue those values, to try to bring those values to the political realm and contest them, it just, to me, that's a disaster. It doesn't work. People hold on to them. They dig in. They embrace wild conspiracy theories. I am a social democrat, and I do think material conditions are what government can address.
Here's my point. That's exactly where I was going. If your theory was right, then we would have a solution to that theory, and I wish your theory was right, because I would dare to have finally a solution to this problem, and your solution would be social democracy, just redistribution a bit more. But
I wouldn't say. I agree with our friend in the back that mobility is more important than
you mean social mobility.
Yeah. So anyway, but yes.
So I'm wondering whether the J.D. Vances of this world, at least the J.D. Vance of Hillbilly Elegy, not the candidate.
Before he became
the candidate Vance. And the protagonists of Hillbilly Elegy would actually find your equal America a solution, or whether they wouldn't opt for something that I would call respectful America.
Well, respect and equality are related to each other, aren't they? I mean, if you see a privileged class that is permanent and protecting its privileges, you feel they don't respect you. And they probably don't. How do you change that? You could tell them you should start respecting Red America more. I'm saying I don't think those kinds of changes are possible in that direct way. Or you could slowly begin to change the conditions of people's lives, and then their thoughts might start to change. And it's slow, it's indirect. They might not even know it's happening. They might be clinging to the... I just have to hope that even if J.D. Vance says, you don't know anything about me, I despise you, and I always will, and I don't want any of your $15 an hour minimum wage, I still would like to think that a $15 an hour minimum wage might lower the temperature a little bit. But I may be wrong. I completely welcome your skepticism.
Lawrence.
So I'm going to express a little skepticism from the other side. I'm going to kind of return to Dan's question about whether it's race or inequality / mobility. And I know you attended to the issues of race, but I think it was in The Atlantic that I read, and who knows, maybe you wrote this, that there was a study of the participants in the January 6th insurrection. And what was very interesting is they were not downwardly mobile. They were not people who were suffering economically. Actually, they weren't even people from red communities. They tended to be people from purple communities. And the one really notable demographic fact is those communities were marked by higher social mobility of minority groups. So it was seeing minority groups actually experiencing better social mobility that became, it seemed like, the engine for a lot of this this politics of grievance.
Yeah, I did see. I didn't write about that study, but I definitely read it, and it was really interesting. It was quite. Isabel? Sorry. Yeah, it was quite detailed. I mean, I think they went through the biography of pretty much everybody who faced criminal charges, right? So I would say, yeah, that's really an interesting study. That's a study of the people who went to sack the Capitol. It's not a study of the 74 million people who voted for Trump. And I still want to preserve some distinction between those two groups, because I don't think that they're interchangeable, or that those 74 million could all have gone to sack the Capitol. So why were they from the blue states or the purple states? Maybe because those states were closer to Washington. I don't know. Why is it that the education gap keeps widening in Republican and Democratic voting? It isn't the wealth. It isn't a wealth gap. It's an education gap. So I think it's people who essentially are part of the old economy more, who are on more like the downside. They may be contractors who are making a pretty good living, but they're contractors. They're not working with computers. And that gap between people who are educated in the knowledge economy and people who are in the old economy is really the fundamental gap in white America. To me, that's a gap that has both economic and cultural resonance. And I continue to think, and there have been studies that bear this out, that those two are work with each other. Because otherwise, why wouldn't everyone in the law firms around Washington, D.C. have raced to the Capitol to hang their congressman? Those 700 or 800 people, I think, are maybe not. I think it's hard to generalize about real America from the people who got arrested at the Capitol. But it does raise exactly the thought that you're proposing, which is it is the success of minorities, of non-white people, and not the failure of white people that is driving the rage. Yeah, I'm open to that idea. I just am a little skeptical that that one study can tell us everything there is to know. Yeah.
I think Isabel's telling me we're towards the end of our time, but let's gather one or two more.
Hi, my name is Emanuela Wilm, and I'm German. And in my view, I would like to ask you, do you think actually that the dual party system you have in the US and that no other party is really being able to come up and really rise differently from Germany, for example, where we had the Greens rising and really creating a completely different culture, more or less, political culture? Look at Macron, his party was completely new, established and created. Is that not also blocking America of creating equality and creating a evolving democracy, a different democracy?
Yeah, and you could throw in the filibuster, the composition of the Senate, the Electoral College, all the features of our constitutional democracy that seem now to be sclerosis, blocking the innovation of new ideas and the passing of new legislation. Absolutely true. Why are we a two-party country? There's been lots of books written about this, and maybe there's a political scientist here who wants to explain it. But it isn't. It's currently playing into polarization, and there's all sorts of people proposing more European-type elections that wouldn't require constitutional changes, but proportional representation, ranked choice voting, the national popular vote, which would mean that every state would have to send its electors to vote for the national, the winner of the national vote, so that it would truly be the majority who decide. Some of them are succeeding. Maine has this, but we have this system of two parties, winner take all, that seems, I don't know why it's so deeply embedded, but every third party that has had a little flicker of life has ended up being absorbed by one of the two parties. And as AOC said in any other country, she and Joe Biden would belong to different parties. Instead, the Democratic Party is now very uneasily trying to absorb this progressive insurgency and make it part of its party, just as the Republican Party was absorbed by the real America insurgency and changed by it, rather than a whole new party that's like, the Pat Buchanan party emerging. So there's just this, I don't quite understand it, and maybe someone smarter than me could explain it, but it seems like a pretty permanent feature of American politics, even though it is currently a major part of the sclerosis, the decadence that we're suffering from.
I mean, the interesting thing is that the two-party system used to be said to be a source of American cohesion because both parties were big tent parties and they had to make lots of coalitions. That doesn't seem to be the case right now.
Well, what's interesting is the consensus theory is that American politics was always played between, and to use the football metaphor, the 40-yard lines, basically somewhere around the middle of the field. There was never a strong socialist movement. There was never a strong fascist movement. Today, socialism and fascism are much more a part of the possible ways in which American politics can move, and that's why I think Trump brought us closer to Europe. Even though he is a recognizable American demagogue out of Mark Twain, his politics have become a politics that Europeans should recognize.
Well, I think it's a sign of the excellence of this conversation that we could go on for a lot longer. Unfortunately, I'm told by my staff that we can't go on a lot longer because we have a lot of equality here at the American Academy. But I want to thank George Packer for coming. I want to just say briefly that our next event is on Monday at 6:15 Central European Time. It'll be the Ellen Maria Gorison Artist Talk given by our fellow Eric Wesley, presenting, and I quote, "Early project models and discussions of recent developments concerning the dynamics of future physical manifestations." You won't want to miss that. And we very much look forward to having you join us for that event. And again, George, thank you. A fascinating talk.
It was really my pleasure. Thank you.